Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I am Anarita Bashalieva, along with co-hosts Dr. Victor Fett, Dr. Katerina Shrey, and our program producer, Professor Larry Shrey. We host a weekly discussion panel on Russia's war on Ukraine with guests from Ukraine, military experts, medical personnel, academics, artists, literary figures, and relief workers. Our panel is recorded and circulated nationally and internationally. We appreciate your comments and feedback. Special thanks to Marshall University Libraries and MUIT for making this weekly event possible. If you are joining us live on Teams, please feel free to use the chat to post any questions for our guest. A quick greetings to our viewers in Ukraine from Dr. Katerina Shrey.
Вітаємо наших слухачів в Україні з глибоким покліном. Ми далі свідки вашого страшного терпіння і також вашої великої сили. Дякую вам за вашу участь в нашій тижневій програмі.
Thank you, Katerina. Today's guest will be introduced by Dr. Victor Fett.
Thank you, Anara. It's my pleasure to introduce and welcome back to MUkraine for our 229th weekly meeting. Dr. Vitaly Chernetsky, Professor of Slavic Languages and Literature from University of Kansas, USA. Her native of Odesa, Ukraine, Professor Chernetsky completed his Ph.D. in University of Pennsylvania, and prior to coming to Kansas, he taught at Columbia, at Miami University, Ohio. His research focuses on modern contemporary cultures, literature, film, popular culture of Ukraine, Russia, Central and Eastern Europe, and Central Asia, and he is the current president of the Shevchenko Scientific Society here in the United States. Dr. Chernetsky, the microphone is yours, please.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, good evening, everyone, depending on where you're joining us from. Вітання всім, доброго дня, добрий вечір. The talk that I will be sharing with you today is part of my ongoing research where I'm trying to connect contemporary Ukrainian literature, especially the last 4+ years since the start of the full-scale invasion, and with the echoes of the past traumatic events in the history of Ukrainian literature and mass waves of displacement. So I am going to start a PowerPoint, and everything will become clearer once you see the PowerPoint and we get into it. Hold on just one second. So as you can see, the title of my presentation today is Traumatic Rhymes, Contemporary Ukrainian Refugee Experience and the Cultural Legacies of the 1940s Displacement. And I would like to start talking about trauma and the relationship between trauma and time. And I'm basing this capsule summary on the writing of Dr. Deborah Wesselman, but there is, of course, a lot of other research on how time is experienced in the context of severe psychological trauma. And it would not be exaggeration to say, of course, that the current situation of the full-scale war is severely traumatizing Ukrainian society. And basically, the main point here is that there is a severe disruption with how a person or even a group of people, but especially on the individual level, of how we experiencing time, because traumatic memories are stored differently than normal memories. They are, as the specialists say, encapsulated in unmetabolized form in the limbic or emotional region of the brain, an area of the brain in which time has no meaning and where which is focuses on being forever vigilant. So if I or if a person has suffered a trauma 1, 2, 10, 20, or even 40 years previously, something can remind the limbic brain of the original danger. It could be a sound, it could be a smell, it could be a sight, and it in a split second, a person might find themselves arguing or fighting or hiding in fear, and one may be as confused as others as to the extreme behaviors that one is not able to explain, and later one may be overwhelmed by guilt and shame. And also, very importantly, some trauma survivors dissociate, meaning the front, the rational part of the self, becomes separated from the emotional parts of the self, and a person might find themselves suddenly operating from an emotional part of the self that holds the feeling relating to the trauma. And in this case, the person may lose touch with the reality and forget the year, their age, and the passage of time. They could be back again in the middle of that experience as pictures flash before their eyes and sounds bombard their brain. And it may take seconds, minutes, or even hours for that person to remember where they are, who they are today in the present time. Sorry. And so in trying to theoretically process the relationship between time and trauma and disruption, we also need to get away from the old familiar division of time into linear and cyclical as the two possible options. Like usually we think, for instance, of the modern civilization associated especially with Christianity as a linear time, or traditional rural societies operating upon cyclical time. So we need to get away from those both of those conceptions. And here I am building on the work of the German historian and philosopher Reinhard Koselleck, who proposed to look at experience of time through the idea of geological sediment. So historical time for Koselleck consists of multiple layers that refer to each other in a reciprocal way, though without being wholly dependent upon each other. And another theorist who is crucially important for me is Michael Rothberg, now at UCLA, and his idea of multi-directional memory. And this is a concept that has been very influential, but also a bit controversial, especially in Germany, where there has been a very prolific debate about it. And basically, to sum up, many of the audience members may already be familiar with his theoretical concepts, and that is he is talking about getting away and getting beyond the tension that is associated with understanding experiences of particular group that has suffered greatly in a competitive way, in a zero-sum way. And his particular case study is the trauma and the memory and the experience of the Holocaust and those of slavery and colonization. And basically, Rothberg argues that it cannot be that, like, by focusing too much on the one, we are crowding out, we are pushing away from our discussion and consideration the other one. And he said that, on the contrary, one can develop a way in which collective memories build on each other through a dialogic process of borrowing, echoing, and appropriation. And we also need to recognize that it has been there in the past. One imagines and one processes and makes sense of particular traumatic historic events in borrowing the conceptual tools, sometimes unconsciously, that are associated with other matters. So, but it could be done passively, it could be done unconsciously, but Rothberg proposes that we think of it in a proactive, dynamic, non-zero-sum logic, which he proposes to call multi-directional memory. So this was like a theoretical preamble, and before we get to the primary subject, I would like to remind the audience, again, some of the audience members may be very much familiar with this material, but others might not. Since we're talking about displacement, what have been the waves of modern era Ukrainian displacement? The first one really is the immigration to the New World, starting in the late 1880s, early 1890s, with immigration to Brazil, Canada, and the United States, eventually some other countries too, like Argentina, but Brazil, Canada, and the US were the first. And here, again, some audience members may be familiar with this classic text, the short story Камінний хрест, A Stone Cross by Vasyl Stefanik, who was a great early modernist Ukrainian writer. And in that story, Stefanik talks about the first family that decides to leave the village, their native village, and to move to Canada. And this is the initiative of the children, but we are also shown the parents, especially the father, Ivan. And we first get a close-up of how hard he worked, how difficult was his toil in this field with poor soil in the mountains. But still, he was deeply attached to that land, to that identity and experience. So in the story, the family decides to stage and organize, as a going away, a wake for themselves. So basically, they organize a mourning event, but not for anyone deceased, but for themselves, since once they will be gone from the village, there will be no way to continue this symbolic tie. But here we have a key quote on the screen from the translation by Danilo Struk. Just as when some wave dislodges a huge stone from the water and places it on the shore, then that stone sits on the beach heavy and spiritless. The sun chips off pieces of old sediment and draws small phosphorescent stars on it. That stone blinks with dead reflections from the rising and the setting of the sun, and with its stone eyes it looks at the live water and longs for the weight of the water which no longer presses against it, as it had for ages. It looks from the shore at the water as if it were some lost happiness. So Ivan looked at the people like the stone at the water. In other words, it is experienced as a disruption, but not a successful processing of the disruption to the point of leaving a destination of developing a new identity. The focus is on the disruption, and it is tantamount to a symbolic death in the context of the original traditional rural community. If we look at other literatures and cultures of the region, especially in the context of the collapse of the Russian Empire, the revolution of 1917, and eventual Bolshevik takeover, there have been several prominent emigre displaced cultures that emerged. Think of Russia, of course, but also think of Georgia in that context and some others. And Ukraine was no exception to that. But it is very interesting in that when we look at that 1920s wave of displacement and its cultural processing, in difference from the Russians and to some extent also the Georgians, Ukrainians who are part of that diasporic community of those newly displaced people, they have not really been focusing on that trauma. They are much more, including in their poetry, in the essay writing, and other work, the focus was on imagining Ukraine's future, and also reflected the writer's fascination with philosophy and history. They wanted to prove that Ukraine is a modern, progressive European and global culture on par with others. So it is this element of catching up and proving, or trying to prove, that was the determining factor for that 1920s wave. But we have a huge symbolically and culturally important element in the displacement as a result of World War II and the displaced persons or DP camps that were set up in the American occupation zone in Germany and Austria, to which about 100,000, maybe a little less than 100,000 people came. So proportionally, it is a smaller part of the Ukrainian diaspora than the earlier mass immigrations to Canada, Brazil, the US, and Argentina, which brought somewhere in the vicinity of over 1 million to the US and Canada each, and at least 800,000 to Brazil, and at least 600,000 to Argentina. So huge amounts of people. But those were overwhelmingly people coming from the countryside, not necessarily highly educated people. By contrast, the DP camps, immigration was highly educated. It was highly motivated. It was also very strongly conscious of their identity. Many of its members were siblings, spouses, and children of victims of the Great Terror in the Soviet Union. So their husbands or wives or brothers or sisters were shot, or they were sent to the Gulag, or they experienced other misfortunes. And so that diaspora, that wave of displacement was incredibly thoughtful and organized and proactive. And it had an outstanding outpouring of creativity across many different art forms. You see here on the slide a reproduction of a paintings by Yakov Ozhak Gnizdovsky, who became probably the most prominent, the most famous Ukrainian-American artist after World War II. The work of Gnizdovsky was found in the White House. I mean, it has found itself in many museums, but he's mostly known as a graphic artist, and he does very stylized, ornamentalized graphic work featuring animals and plants. What you see here is a completely different thing. We see a fairly realistic painting that shows multiple bank beds in the barracks, which is basically where those DP camps were held, and where people were trying to hold on to their lives or move forward. And very clearly you can see somebody who's creatively reminiscing or thinking about things. We can see somebody who is clearly a scholar of some sort and who is writing something on the wall and is surrounded with books. We see people simply trying to raise a family. We see people dealing with challenges of privations of war and their toll on their health. So all of this is coming together, and that's why this painting, I think it's a great way of symbolically representing the DP camp experience of the late 1940s. But yes, those camps were especially rich in their literary activities. So Mur, or Mistецький Український Рух, which translates as the Artistic Ukrainian Movement, which existed from 1945 to 1948, became an outstanding organizing and motivating phenomenon and a platform for debating the future of Ukrainian literature and its role in the global context and the ways it could answer the challenges of modernity, but through all of it, also processing what does it mean to be, for that activity is happening in that strange heterotopic space, to use a term from Michel Foucault, something that is inside and outside, something that is in a disrupted place. It's not a dystopia, not a utopia, but it's clearly elsewhere. That's why heterotopia. And you see here the cover of the first almanac of Mur that was published in early 1946. And there were a lot of very important things happening at the DP camps, but also they later got reflected and debated by others. So if we think of the key texts that come from the DP camps and that deal with the topic of the DP camps, there are several writers that deserve to be highlighted. I have here the covers of the works of two, Yuri Kosach and his Enei і життя інших, Aeneas and the Lives of Others, which is this surrealist experimental short novel published in 1947. And you see a retroactive memoirs by Ulas Samchuk, Planeta DP, Planet DP, which is a meticulous reconstruction from memory of the experience of displacement from the mid-40s onwards, and reflecting also in this retroactive way on the cultural, political, social, and also everyday context of what the life in those DP camps was like. But to me, the arguably creatively and for us the most important representation of what the DP camps were like and what was the individual human experience of them, and that is something that echoes very much with contemporary culture, in my opinion. And this is a retroactive look at the DP camps and their experience by one of Ukraine's most prominent late modernist, postmodernist experimental writers, Emma Andiyevska, who is 95 years young and still going strong. This is her novel that she wrote in the late 1960s, and it was published in 1973, Roman про добру людину, a novel about a good person. And it is set at one of the DP camps that was particularly prominent in the Ukrainian experience, and this is Mittenwald, which is located in the mountains in the Alps, very close to Germany's border to Austria, not far from Innsbruck, but just right across the border on the German side. And nowadays it's famous as a mountain resort. But yes, there in the military barracks, this major camp was set up, and there were three main groups in the camp coexisting. And these were Ukrainians, Lithuanians, and Jewish survivors of the concentration camps. And all those groups were present there. But what is important for us is that Andiyevska creates an experienced reality. So in truly following the ideas that the difference between realist fiction and modernist fiction is that instead of trying to give us some sort of objective, distanced, omniscient portrait of the world, we are given an individualized, experiential approach, entry into it. And one of the main points is that we experience this through many different characters, including the main character, the title character, who becomes the titular good person, who starts out at the beginning of the novel as a petty thief trying to steal a piglet from the local German farmers. But it is a text where we see time behaving in a totally different way. It's like a piece of Swiss cheese with holes and strange connections. And on the one hand, the life in the camps was, in a sense, a perpetual present. because people were not in charge of their own future, because as refugees and in displaced persons camps, they were at the mercy of the Allied powers and other countries that are potentially willing to accept them for settlement as refugees. And life went on, but it was a strange way in which you could not imagine, you could not experience or plan the future. So you're stuck in that sense of perpetual present. But you also have, in full accordance with theories of trauma time, people experiencing time where sudden shifts are possible, where characters find themselves on the streets of Kyiv all of a sudden, or somewhere else, or even imagining their own future, or having visions, not just imagination, but visions, clear visions of what their future is going to be like. So this strange experience of disrupted time and many different temporalities possible. There is a wonderful book by a German-American scholar, Ursula Heiser, who also is now a professor at UCLA, which is called Chronoschisms. And it's her monograph from back in the late 1990s about the subversive presentation of time in some contemporary fiction. And I think that very much would be a productive way of looking at Andrzejewska's work, and especially of what this novel is trying to do, how it approaches that experience of trauma survival and being in those camp environment, and how the characters try to safeguard their lives, make sense of their lives, how they can go on living and figure out what to do with themselves. And what I would like to argue, and again, this is a tentative argument, and this is the ongoing something that I'm actively thinking through, is how literature on displacement in the aftermath of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, so since February of 2022, how it in some ways echoes that representation and those senses of trauma time. One of the key examples for me comes from the poetry of Irina Shuvalova. And this is especially her collection Kinechny Pisni and Songs, which was published in book form in Ukraine in 2024. And now Irina is collaborating with Professor Ujem Blacker from School of Slavonic East European Studies, University of London, on the English language version that is forthcoming shortly. And there is especially a very important cycle there written in February, March 2022. So in the full first weeks of full-scale invasion. And Irina, at the time, found herself in Nanjing, China. She was working in China, and so she actively reflected, thought through what it meant to be experiencing this horrific trauma of war, but also not experiencing it on the ground, experiencing and being far removed locale, especially as distant from Ukraine as China, which is also a country with a very equivocal relationship to the current war. And here I have a key quote from her explaining this, that my new book, End Songs, is first and foremost about my personal, but familiar to all of us, experience of distancing in time or separation in time from my own self. So you see, the disruption of time is one of those central concepts that she's trying to work through in her poetry. And on the next slide, I will provide a short quote from one of her poems, and in the translation by Emilia Glazer and Yulia Ilchuk. So different translators, but I think this is really powerful. So she talks about the experience of trauma, the experience of war and all of its horror and monstrosity, and the responsibility of the poet to present it. So I will let you read the English as you see it on the slide. For the sake of our talk, I will read the Ukrainian out loud so you can hear the melody and the intensity of it. Ось, тут воно лежить, це невимовне, важке, як мертве тіло дорогої людини, довге, як ніч, коли мають бомбити. Бери невимовне попід мокрі від крові пахви, тягни його, лишай сліди. Нехай на ранок їх буде видно здалеку. In other words, it is something that is incredibly traumatic, but it's very important. In fact, it is an ethical imperative to make it visible, to make it communicatable to others. Another example for me is from the work of Sofia Andruchovich, a wonderful contemporary writer. In fact, as you see on the slide, I describe her as a leading Ukrainian novelist of her generation. My own translation of one of her novels, Felix Austria, published in 2014, is forthcoming in September, so very, very soon, from the Ukrainian literature series at Harvard. And in the context of the full-scale invasion, Sofia turned to a series of essays. She was not previously publishing nonfiction. She became a very active nonfiction writer with wonderful, moving, and powerful, of course, also disturbing essays under the umbrella title Defensive Reactions, Захисні реакції, that was published online simultaneously in Ukrainian and a Polish translation in the online journal Dvutygodnik, and also later they were collected in French into a book titled Tout ce qui est humain, so all that is human. And in the essays from that collection, from that cycle, she very much works through how, in the context of war and the trauma that war brings, new ways of experiencing reality, new ways of experiencing the ways one relates to others are becoming prominent. So on the slide, I have the covers of two of the essays. One is literally says, I'm fine, and the other one is shame. And both saying that I am fine in the face of war and suffering and destruction and death is, of course, a defensive reaction, but something that you protect yourself, but also could be repressing the trauma. And the sense of shame, which is something that, if you remember the beginning of the first theoretical slide, is something that is very much associated with the experience of trauma and the return of trauma and the disruption of time. So shame is very often an emotion that accompanies those experiences. But even more so, there is a wonderful nonfiction book that is not yet available in English translation, but I very much hope that it will become soon. And it is a book by Oksana Shchur, who was the managing director of Knizhkovy Arsenal, one of Ukraine's leading literary festivals taking place in Kyiv every year in the spring, in May. But in 2022, literally a few days before the start of the full-scale invasion, she found herself abroad in Western Europe. So when the full-scale war broke out, she was not able to go back to Ukraine. She is now based in Berlin. And in her book of essays that was eventually published in 2025 entitled Cassandra Errs Once, Cassandra Помиляется раз. She reflects on all those experiences. And it is notable that even though she eventually chose a different title, her original working title for the manuscript was Vertriebene DP. In other words, she uses the German word for displaced persons and specifically the Ukrainian use of the English language acronym that became so prominent. And the first version was completed already in the fall of 2022, so quite early. And that is the work where she directly invokes the DP legacy, in part because we have this palimpsest of Ukrainian experiences, including in continental Europe, including in Germany in particular, where the legacies of those earlier displacements are very, very palpable. And what is also important and notable, and this is an example of this sort of multi-directional engagement, she very much directly engages with the work of the recently deceased wonderful Croatian writer Dubravka Ugrešić, and her remarkable book from the 1990s called The Museum of Unconditional Surrender, in which she reflects on her own experience of being a displaced person who left the wars in the Western Balkans in the former Yugoslavia in the early 1990s. But of course, she left in peace and comfort. She left as an internationally famous writer on literary residencies. And then in the streets of Berlin, she ran into Bosnian refugees who escaped the horrors of Sarajevo and Srebrenica and other places. And what did it mean for her to be with them, somewhat like them, but not appropriating their trauma, not speaking for them and making their voices suppressed? So not drowning out their experiences, but ethically engaging and combining her own experience, which also had its fair share of trauma. If you know the history of several prominent Croatian feminist writers and scholars, of whom Dubravka Ugrešić and Slavenka Drakulić, who also passed away a few weeks ago. So now they're both gone, those two leading figures. They were the highly prominent members of that remarkable literary generation who were pushed out of the native country and who became spokespersons for displacement, specific displacement from the wars in former Yugoslavia, but also displacement more universally. So Stur in her book very actively engages directly with that experience. And we are getting first fictional treatment. It is often said that wars in their horrific trauma are more conducive to processing through poetry and nonfiction, and fiction, especially novels, stand away at a greater distance. But there are always exceptions to that rule. And to me, the novel Drabina, The Ladder by Yevgenia Kuznetsova, which won the BBC Ukrainian Book of the Year in 2024, the book itself was published the previous year in 23, is a very important pioneering treatment of that. And the setup of the book is at the center, we have a house in Spain. I was at a Ukrainian IT worker, a computer engineer, who moved to Spain a long time ago, made for himself a professional career, wanted to have peace and quiet. I mean, his family life did not quite work out, and so he is divorced by himself, but he is investing in this house, and it's going to be a perfect house where you'll have comfort, where he'll have his collection of electric guitars, and all sort of things are going to be good. And the full-scale invasion happens, and he takes in as refugees a lot of family members, close and distant, and even neighbors and family friends. So there's a motley crew of displaced persons from Ukraine, including their pets, now in that house. And there is a certain tragicomic element because people are people, and there would be inadvertently some comic situations there, but underneath it all is this profound sense of trauma and coping with it and trying to work through it. So it is sort of a deceptively easy style that Kuznetsova chooses for her novel, and it reads as some sort of television sitcom with a script with all these multiple characters in one space. But you realize, and then you have that feeling throughout the whole book, that beneath that surface is the very tragic, surreal, and powerful experience of people who had to leave their homes, whose lives had been destroyed, and now they find themselves displaced in this new place. And the book does not have a happy ending at all. The book has a very traumatic ending too, but it can be said that, especially because on the surface it is this sort of sitcom-like plot, it approaches trauma and multiple traumas that all those characters have indirectly. And those kind of using mass culture genres and sort of this deceptively easy style to talk about very traumatic events is actually something that for which we have a couple of other precedents elsewhere. I'm especially thinking of a novel by a wonderful Serbian writer who is a great friend of Ukraine, has volunteered and fundraised a lot since the full-scale invasion in Serbia, again, the country that has not been always very friendly and supportive towards Ukraine, and that's Vladimir Arsenievich. And Arsenievich has a novel called In the Hold, U Potpalublu, which talks about the start of the war between Serbia and Croatia in the fall of 1990, and talks about really serious and traumatic things, but using the genre conventions of a soap opera. So he uses the soap opera conventions to tell the story, while the subject matter could not be more serious and somber. So to sum up some of the takeaways that I propose, and again, this is work in progress, so this is a working hypothesis. Contemporary Ukrainian writing on war-related displacement is rich, diverse, and strong. This is something that clearly this audience knows already, but this bears emphasizing and repeating. And I would argue that it often delivers a veritable epistemic breakthrough. And I especially would like to refer the audience to a forum on poetic responses to the current war in the fall 2024 issue of Slavic Review, to which I had the honor of being one of the contributors. A very important point is that contemporary writing on the displacement beyond Ukraine's borders is overwhelmingly by women authors. And this reflects the demography of the current wave of displacement. As we know, most Ukrainian men aged from the early 20s to 60 cannot leave Ukraine, and because of the war. There is a shared emphasis on empathy, on multiplicity of the layers of trauma, and also on the dilemmas of local and global belonging and non-belonging, and on resilience and on limits to this resilience. Again, this audience knows very well the current discourse, the ongoing discourse on how wonderfully resilient Ukrainians are in the face of the horrible war and all the privations that it has brought. But this fetishizing of Ukrainian resilience can become a double-edged sword, because Ukrainians, of course, are people of flesh and blood. They have limits to how much physically their bodies can take, how much pain, how much mobilization in the conditions of stress they can take. The DP camps writing gave us literature with a transformed relationship to time that is post-traumatic, time that is non-linear, time that is, as it were, suspended and multi-directional. And I would argue that contemporary Ukrainian writing has been engaging with the 1940s DP camps legacy, both as a source of what could be done. In other words, we have an example of how Ukrainian creative intellectuals tried to express that experience, how they tried to organize, how they could try to foster coping and thinking through those experiences in their creative work. And also as what might be best to avoid, because there was actually a lot of factional fighting within the DP camps, and literary organizations like MUR did fall apart, and sometimes things could get really acrimonious between the individual people participating in them. So avoiding that and recognizing that trauma can also really sharpen sometimes our emotional responses that could trigger non-rational and potentially harmful behaviors that we can, if we have an advanced awareness and understanding, we can be proactive in our responses to them. And of course, also, it does not need to be communicated to this particular audience, but I hope this is a message that you would carry and share with your friends and colleagues elsewhere. Contemporary Ukrainian writing, including on writing on war-related displacement, strongly deserves to be better known globally for all its rich insights and breakthroughs. Thank you very much for your attention. I'm going to stop sharing my PowerPoint now.
Thank you very much, Dr. Chernetsky. This was a wonderful review. I already see a question from Dr. Deutsch, our former graduate dean, and here is Len, please.
Okay. In the United States, Trump has had a terrific impact on our consciousness, on our way of life. And nonetheless, our writers continue predominantly to write traditional romance, science fiction, murder mystery, the genres that have been written in the past. It seems that the extent of the trauma in Ukraine is such that writing has been consumed and gone in a somewhat different direction. What percentage of the writing in Ukraine and outside of Ukraine from the diaspora do you think 50%, more than 50%, deals with the psychological impact of the trauma of displacement? Less, more? What percentage?
I would say that especially in the last 4 years, I mean, it was different when we think about the earlier stage of the war between 2014 and 2021. But since February 2022, I mean, this is unavoidable, the topic. This is the elephant in the room. And so while, yes, there is escapist literature, if you wish, like fantasy, young adult writing, or science fiction writing, but even there, those traumas, they are filtered in and they're somehow present to some extent or the other. So if thinking about the science fiction sort of, space operas of Max Kidruk, who is one of the leading contemporary Ukrainian science fiction writers, yes, it's some sort of can be distant colony on a satellite of Jupiter or something like that, but there are echoes of this current war and the experiences that even filter there. Or there is, I mentioned Sofia Andruchovich, one of her novels that it hasn't been translated yet It has this curious title, Katananke, which is actually a Latin name of a flower, a pretty garden flower, but it sounds like something that should be a name for a passion or some sort of emotional condition. And in that book, it's a future post-war Ukraine, but it's a severely society that carries in it so much trauma that it can trigger irrational, unexpected behaviors that the characters themselves are not often sure how to process. So this is something that definitely is present there. So I would say that it is an unavoidable topic, and in terms of reading, Ukrainians, very avid readers, and even in conditions of the war, the publishing world is having a boom, but they're reading a lot of translated literature in addition to domestic literature from the US and internationally from the West, from the global South, from all sorts of places. And some of it, yes, can be a way of escaping, but I would say that the majority of the writing, even when people seek out right now, it could be like fantasy writing in English, but it could be something that for them helps deal with that trauma and helps try to process it.
Very interesting answer. Thank you.
More questions, please? As you're thinking, yes, Katerina, please.
So lots to process. I have to say, and this is probably inappropriate, but you exceed your reputation, and I'm so grateful to you. I appreciate how you've spoken about this, and I have a bunch of reactions more so than a question. Again, lots to process. Thank you for the preamble at the very beginning, for laying out the theoretical preamble of what you're going to talk about. That was incredibly helpful as we then went in to talk about that first wave of immigrants, and then the one that I think my parents came through, the 1940s one. So I appreciated that theoretical context very much, and I'm excited to look up the authors and the partners that you've cited there. I'm having an emotional response because Mur, Vasil Stefanik, Emma, and Dioshka, these are all groups of poets we studied in my Ukrainian school upbringing. I grew up in Philadelphia in a Ukrainian community, and that my parents' generation worked really hard to establish Ukrainian institutions, schools, scouts, dance clubs, things like that. And so I remember studying sorry, I'm getting emotional, it's funny. I remember studying for the Matura exam that you take at the end of your 12 years. And I remember specific questions on Mur, which is really funny, you know, and having zero appreciation as a child, what that would have meant to the people who contributed to that collection, to those volumes. So I'm very grateful for that. And your presentation helped me understand something that I've heard my entire childhood, but didn't really appreciate. Periodically, you would have two Ukrainian immigrants meet, and they would start talking of Stabari. They know each other as Stabaro, Buliv Stabari Ras. They were in camp together, and it always seemed to have some kind of meaning that's sort of like, went over my head. So, two older people had similar experiences, but apparently the trauma bonding there, I mean, it was, now that you've put it in this context, I get it. I think I'm starting to get it. I do understand that. My husband, when he married into our family, my husband's American. He noticed that within a few minutes of meeting any one of my aunts or uncles, inevitably, at some point, they would start talking about their experience Tawadi in the camp. And that's and so when you talk about the presence of time, this elastic understanding of time, this multi-directional, not this the presence. I think that's probably what that was. Like there's this is a story you have to tell if you're going to understand me. This is a story you have to hear, and so I'm just incredibly grateful to you for on so many levels. And then finally, I think that as you were talking about, and I think I've lost the name here, Kuznetsova,
yes,
who wrote the letter, the one who wrote the letter.
Yeah, Yevgenia Kuznetsova, yes.
So the idea of talking about these tragic things with comedy and using perhaps modern genres, it reminded me, Victor, here, again, if you could help me out, was it Irina Potapenko, the illustrator who has a cartoon series? So we know her from illustrating Rudy and the Milky Way, but she also has a series of I think it's not a graphic novel, it's a series of panels, and it shows a girl who's a skeleton and her cat who's a friend, and they're basically two young people processing the war, and it's comical, but it's grisly at the same time, and they're talking
Yes.
about like really traumatic things. So I'm just I saw what the topic was going to be today. I was excited about it, but I had no idea how wide-ranging and how meaningful and important it is. I'm very, very grateful to you. Thank you for taking the time to share all this with us. I'm just very grateful. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and it is it's deeply meaningful to me, and I greatly appreciate what you're saying. But yes, this is something that helps us understand those the generations of our parents and grandparents, what they survived, what they went through, and how there's certain things that they wanted to talk about, and also some things that absolutely refused to talk about, because they're all, so they're memories that they would share and they would flood them, but also there'll be memories that they will be deeply suppressed because they were just so painful that opening them up would just multiply the pain. So learning from those, this, one cannot be grateful to the horrors of the war for anything. I mean, this is a horrible, damaging, traumatic experience. But this current war and what we're experiencing now helps us understand their experiences better. And we have the echoes and the linkages, and we see the creative people now trying to make sense of this. And there are a lot of, yes, very powerful things. There are novels, there are books for children. There is a writer now living in London, Katerina Babkina. She has a novel, sort of a young adult novel called Mom Pam'yatayesh, Mom, Do You Remember? And this is from the point of view of, is a young woman, a teenager actually, who is severely traumatized and whose mother was killed. And she is now living, I believe her parents were divorced, and now she's living with the father in Vienna. But she refuses to talk to the therapist. She totally shuts down. She does not want to talk to anyone. But the therapist encourages her to write letters to her mother. So we then follow those letters. And in those letters, she gradually starts processing the past and the present, and they become a way of some kind of tentative healing, of developing a coping mechanism and a possibility of going forward. And that is, of course, something that is crucial and important.
Wow, thank you. I also just want to say too, you mentioned Michael Rothberg about that it's not competition. I think that's incredibly important too. I think it's incredibly important too. And actually what you just said shows the benefits of it not being a competition, the shared healing that can happen.
Yes.
So
of course.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for being with us, Dr. Chernetsky. This is a privilege and a pleasure. And this was very touching hour. I'm sure people will appreciate the recording of this session, and we will share widely. Thank you, Vitaly, and good travels wherever you are.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure and an honor to return to this series and to see you and other colleagues here. And thank you for all the good work you're doing in this series. It's hugely important.
Our great thanks to everyone involved and to everyone out there. Please, Katerina.
Дорогі браття і сестри в Україні, ми зберігаємо вас у наших щоденних думках і молитвах. Нехай милосердний Бог тримає вас у своїй опіці. До наступного тижня прощаємося.
Слава Україні!
Героям
Героям
слава!
слава!